The laugh came first sharp and careless, slicing through the hush of the business-class cabin like a dropped glass. Victoria Reynolds did not mean for it to be cruel. But cruelty often arrives unannounced, wearing confidence like a tailored suit. Across the aisle, a man in a faded gray jacket paused mid-motion, his arms wrapped around a sleeping child. The cabin lights caught the scuff marks on his shoes, the creases of exhaustion on his face. And in that instant, Victoria decided he did not belong here. The flight from Los Angeles to Tokyo had settled into its overnight rhythm. Screens glowed softly. Champagne flutes chimed. Victoria, 34, founder and chief executive of Reynolds Systems, skimmed contract that could reshape markets by morning. She thrived on altitude, both literal and metaphorical. Then her gaze drifted again to seat 12F. The man adjusted the blanket over his daughter with a gentleness that felt almost out of place among leather seats and whispered status. Victoria tilted her head, lips curling. She asked if someone had gifted him the ticket. He answered quietly that he had paid for it with honest work. The dismissal came easily after that. A small wave of her hand. A comment about motivation posters. She returned to her screen, certain the interaction was finished. But the man did not shrink the way she expected. He did not bristle either. He simply resumed rocking the child, his breathing slow, measured as if the world's noise had learned to soften around him. His daughter Emily, 7 years old, clutched a backpack printed with airplanes and slept through the exchange, trusting the steady rise and fall of her father's chest. Michael Carter felt the eyes on him, even when they looked away. At 41, he had learned the weight of judgment and the discipline of ignoring it. He had bought the tickets after spotting a pricing error and saving for years because Emily had one wish she repeated like a prayer. She wanted to see Japan. She wanted to stand in a museum and point at wings and ask how the sky held them up. Michael had promised her they would go. Promises mattered more than comfort. They mattered more than pride. Around them, business class breathed its particular air of entitlement. Watches glinted, conversations murmured about acquisitions and exits. Victoria accepted a flute of champagne and raised an eyebrow when the attendant offered Michael the same. He declined and asked for water. She laughed again, softer this time, amused by what she read as false humility. Michael met her eyes calm and unchallenged, and said he did not drink when someone depended on him. The words landed heavier than he intended. She shrugged, unimpressed, already turning back to her world. A senior flight attendant watched from the galley, instincts prickling. 15 years in the air. Taught her to notice posture stillness, the way some men occupied space without claiming it. Michael moved like someone trained to wait for orders, then act without hesitation. She filed the observation away, unaware it would soon matter. For now the cabin's settled engines droned, and the Pacific stretched endlessly below them, dark and indifferent. Emily stirred eyes fluttering open for a moment. She whispered that when she grew up, she wanted to fly like her dad. Michael smiled, brushing hair from her face, and told her she would fly even higher. Victoria overheard and scoffed quietly. Dreams were pleasant, she said, but reality paid the bills. Michael turned, then his voice gentle but firm, and replied that reality was simply what people built from their dreams. The space between them tightened, charged with something neither named. As the plane pressed eastward into night, Victoria returned to her contracts, convinced the world made sense. The man in 12F faded into background noise, a footnote in a successful day. Michael closed his eyes, counting breaths, listening to the aircraft speak through vibration and hum. He did not know how close the sky was to breaking. He only knew that if it did, he would stand. Michael Carter had learned long ago that silence could be heavier than words. As the aircraft pushed deeper into the night, the cabin dimmed and conversations dissolved into murmurs and sleep. Emily's head rested against his chest, her small fingers curled into the fabric of his jacket, as if anchoring herself to him. Michael barely moved. He listened instead. To the engines. To the subtle tremor beneath the floor. To the rhythm of a machine that, when healthy, sounded like confidence itself. The sound carried him backward in time to a life he rarely allowed himself to revisit. Before Oregon, before engineering manuals and modest paychecks, before he became the man people overlooked. 13 years in the United States Air Force had trained his ears to hear what others missed. Back then, he had worn a different jacket, one that drew respect before he spoke. His call sign had been Raven, not because he was loud or reckless, but because ravens watched. They waited. And when they moved, they did so with purpose. He had been a flight instructor by 32, one of the youngest in his unit. Pilots trusted his voice because it never wavered. He had guided dozens through their first true emergencies, the kind that burned panic into muscle memory. And then came the training exercise that never left him. A routine maneuver. A calculation off by a breath. An order given, followed without question. 3 aircraft, 3 friends, 3 funerals. The investigation cleared him. His conscience did not. Michael left quietly after that. No speeches, no ceremonies. He folded his uniform one last time and chose a smaller life, believing that shrinking his world might make the weight bearable. He married. He tried to be present. When Emily was born small and fierce and loud, he thought perhaps redemption had arrived wrapped in a blanket. But the past has a way of testing promises. His wife could not live with the silence he carried the nights he woke, drenched in memory. When Emily was 2, she left. Michael stayed. That choice, at least, he never regretted. Across the aisle, Victoria Reynolds closed another file and leaned back, stretching her neck. Her mind buzzed with numbers and leverage, with deals that would shape entire sectors. She had built her company from nothing after her father's death, clawing her way into rooms that had never intended to let her stay. She wore her success like armor, polished and sharp, because she had learned how quickly the world dismissed women who hesitated. Control was her language, confidence her shield. She glanced again at seat 12F, irritation flaring for reasons she did not bother to examine. The man's calm unsettled her. People who belonged here displayed their belonging. They dressed it, announced it. This man did not. He existed as if the cabin were merely another place to sit another night to get through. It offended her sense of order. She told herself it did not matter. By morning, she would be in Tokyo, closing a deal that would make headlines. He would be gone. Forgotten. The flight attendant returned to collect glasses. Emily shifted eyes, blinking open, disoriented. Michael whispered reassurance, tracing slow circles on her back. She asked where they were. Over the ocean, he said. She smiled sleepily and asked if the pilots could see stars from up there. He told her sometimes they could, and sometimes they had to trust instruments more than their eyes. She nodded, absorbing the lesson without knowing it was one he had learned the hard way. Victoria caught the exchange and felt a flicker of something she brushed aside. Sentimentality was inefficient. Still, when Emily's eyes met hers, unguarded and curious, Victoria looked away first. She had no children. No time for that part of life, she told herself. There would be time later. There was always later. Hours passed. The Pacific below remained unseen, a vast black mirror. Then, almost imperceptibly, the aircraft shuddered, a minor adjustment easily dismissed. Most passengers did not notice. Michael did. His breathing changed, not faster, slower. He pressed his palm lightly against the armrest, feeling vibration. The engines corrected. The cabin settled again. He told himself it was nothing. In the cockpit, the captain frowned at a blinking indicator, logged it, and continued. Weather ahead was unstable, but within tolerances. The first officer adjusted course by a fraction, sweat gathering beneath his collar. He was competent, young, confident enough to mask the edge of unease creeping into his thoughts. Another tremor followed, stronger this time. A few heads lifted. Seatbelts chimed on. The cabin lights brightened slightly. Victoria paused mid-scroll, annoyance flickering. Turbulence was an inconvenience, nothing more. She had flown through worse. Still, she tightened her belt and glanced toward the window, searching for reassurance in the dark. Michael's hand tightened around Emily. He did not wake her. He counted seconds between movements, mapping rhythm to memory. Something was off. Not catastrophic. Not yet. But the aircraft no longer sounded entirely sure of itself. His mind began assembling possibilities, running quiet checks without conscious effort. Hydraulics, weather shear, sensor lag. He pushed the thoughts aside, forcing himself to remain a passenger. He was not that man anymore. He had promised himself. The intercom crackled, then went silent. A moment later, the chimes sounded again, sharper. The captain's voice came through, controlled but strained, instructing everyone to remain seated. No explanation followed. The cabin tensed, a collective inhale. Emily stirred at last, sensing the shift. She asked if everything was okay. Michael smiled and told her yes, even as his pulse aligned itself with the aircraft's vibrations. Victoria's irritation hardened into concern. She set her laptop aside. Power meant nothing if the machine carrying her across the world failed. She noticed the man in 12F, now fully alert, gaze unfocused, as if listening to something beyond the cabin. It struck her then that he looked less like a nervous passenger and more like someone waiting for a cue. The flight attendant moved briskly down the aisle, face pale but composed. She stopped briefly at Michael's row eyes, flicking to him with an intensity that surprised him. She opened her mouth as if to speak, then thought better of it and moved on. Michael met her glance and gave a small nod, instinctively reassuring. It was a reflex he did not remember choosing. Another jolt hit the aircraft, violent enough to draw gasps. Luggage rattled. A child cried. The engines roared, compensating. The sound was wrong now. Too loud. Too uneven. Michael closed his eyes for half a second and listened. Somewhere deep within the plane, a system struggled to keep pace with commands. Victoria gripped the armrests, breath shallow. Fear, real fear, cut through her composure for the first time that night. She looked again at Michael, at the way he adjusted Emily's belt with practiced speed, at the calm that did not match the chaos blooming around them. A question surfaced unbidden, sharp and unwelcome. Who exactly was the man in seat 12F? The plane shuddered once more, harder than before, and the cabin lights flickered. In that instant, the distance between who Michael had been and who he pretended to be narrowed to nothing at all. The third impact hit without warning, far more violent than the first two, snapping through the cabin with a force that erased all doubt. This was no longer turbulence. The aircraft dropped sharply, then twisted, sending a surge of panic rippling through every row. Overhead compartments rattled like loose bones. A glass shattered somewhere behind them. The seatbelt sign blazed on, harsh and unforgiving. Michael reacted before fear could form. He turned fully toward Emily, guiding her back into her seat. fastening the belt with practiced precision. His hands were steady, his movements economical. He pressed his forehead briefly to hers and told her to close her eyes to picture the museum. They would visit the old planes hanging silently from the ceiling. Emily nodded, trusting him without question, and did as she was told. The intercom clicked, hissed, then fell silent. That silence was worse than any alarm. Around them, whispers turned into prayers. Breaths came short and uneven. Victoria Reynolds felt her pulse hammer against her ribs. She had faced crises measured in billions moments where entire companies trembled at her decisions. But this was different. There was no boardroom here, no leverage, just metal sky and whatever skill stood between them and disaster. When the captain's voice returned, it no longer carried confidence. He spoke quickly, announcing a technical problem, instructing everyone to remain seated. The message ended abruptly, cut off, as if something had demanded his attention mid-sentence. The plane shuddered again, harder this time, and the illusion of control collapsed entirely. A flight attendant burst from the forward galley, her composure barely holding. She scanned the cabin with desperate urgency and raised her voice, asking if anyone on board had flight experience. Real flight experience. Not casual, not theoretical. Her words hung in the air, heavy and unanswered. No one moved. Fear locked people in place. Eyes dropped, hands clenched. Silence answered her call. Michael stood. The motion was immediate, unmistakable. Victoria's hand shot out, gripping his arm as instinctively as fear itself. She told him to sit down, her voice sharp, commanding, desperate for normalcy. Michael turned toward her, and in that instant she froze. There was no recklessness in his eyes, no bravado, only a calm that felt almost unreal. "I am a professional," he said quietly. He eased her hand away without force and turned back to Emily. He knelt, met her gaze, and told her to stay seated, to count slowly, and to trust him. She reached out, squeezed his fingers once, then let go. The simplicity of the exchange cut deeper than panic ever could. The flight attendant noticed him, then truly noticed him. The way he moved, the way he held himself. She asked again if he had flight experience. Michael answered plainly, 13 years. Military, fighters and transport aircraft, emergency situations. Her eyes widened, relief flooding through fear. She did not question him further. There was no time. As they moved toward the cockpit, the aircraft lurched violently, pitching forward and drawing screams from every corner of the cabin. Victoria watched them disappear through the door, her chest tight, one terrifying thought repeating over and over. If he was wrong, nothing else would matter. Inside the cockpit, order teetered on the edge of collapse. The captain lay slumped in his seat, unconscious oxygen mask dangling uselessly. The first officer, young and overwhelmed, gripped the controls, sweat soaking through his uniform. Warning lights flashed across the panels, a chaotic constellation of alarms demanding impossible choices. Michael stepped inside, and the noise seemed to reorganize around him. He spoke once, firm and clear, cutting through the panic. He told the first officer to breathe. He introduced himself. He asked what the aircraft was doing, not what the alarms were saying. The young pilot answered automatically, clinging to the sound of authority. Michael listened, eyes scanning instruments, body attuned to the aircraft's movement. He recognized the problem instantly. A delayed response, a system struggling to obey commands. He placed a steady hand on the back of the captain's seat, grounding himself, grounding the room. He had buried this world beneath years of quiet living, beneath bedtime routines and modest ambitions, but it rose to meet him without hesitation. In the cabin, Victoria sat frozen, Emily's small hand now wrapped tightly in hers. The girl looked up and asked where her father had gone. Victoria swallowed hard and answered honestly that he was helping. Helping how Emily asked. The words caught, then escaped. He's flying the plane. Emily smiled, utterly certain. Daddy's really good at that. Victoria's hands began to tremble not from turbulence, but from realization. The man she had dismissed as insignificant had walked calmly into the most dangerous room on the aircraft, and everyone inside had instinctively made space for him. Michael did not raise his voice. He did not rush. In the cockpit, calm was not a personality trait, but a tool, and he wielded it with precision. The first officer's breathing was shallow, his hands shaking as he fought the controls. Michael stood just behind him, close enough to be felt, not so close as to overwhelm. He asked the young pilot's name and waited for the answer before continuing. Mark, the first officer, said, his voice barely steady. Michael repeated it once, anchoring him, then told him to take a slow breath and feel the aircraft instead of fighting it. The plane responded with a sluggish hesitation, a half-second delay between command and motion. Michael recognized it instantly. A hydraulic pressure drop on the primary system, not total failure, but enough to turn precision into guesswork. He explained it in simple terms, stripping away panic and jargon. He told Mark which indicators to ignore and which one mattered. He pointed to a breaker panel, a small red switch easily missed in chaos, and instructed him to reset it before switching to the auxiliary system. Mark obeyed, hands still trembling, and felt the controls change beneath his grip. "Good," Michael said quietly. "Now listen to her." He spoke of the aircraft as if it were alive, something to be understood rather than conquered. He guided Mark through each adjustment, each fraction of pitch, each correction measured and deliberate. The alarms continued to blink, but they no longer dictated the rhythm. Michael did. Years of training flowed back into him, muscle memory and instinct aligning, as if no time had passed at all. They could not continue to Tokyo. Michael saw the numbers, the margins, too thin. He calculated distance, fuel weather, and runway length with ruthless speed. Honolulu emerged as the only viable option. He relayed the decision without hesitation, framing it not as a question, but as the next step. Mark nodded relief, flickering across his face as responsibility shifted from terror to execution. Michael took the radio and addressed the cabin. His voice was steady, unhurried, a sound built to be trusted. He told the passengers they had stabilized the aircraft. He explained they would divert for an emergency landing. He instructed them to remain seated and to stay calm. The words did not promise safety, but they carried competence, and that was enough. Applause rippled through the cabin, mixed with sobs of relief. Back in business class, Victoria Reynolds felt her breath finally reach her lungs. Emily squeezed her hand and looked toward the cockpit with quiet pride. She whispered that her daddy was helping everyone. Victoria could not speak. The image of Michael stepping forward replayed in her mind, erasing every careless judgment she had made. She had measured worth by polish and presence, and now those measures felt absurd. The descent was tense, but controlled. Turbulence rattled the aircraft, yet each movement was answered with calm correction. Michael remained focused, guiding Mark through checklists and contingencies, ready for the worst, but committed to the present. When the runway lights appeared through broken cloud, he allowed himself one measured breath. This was the moment where discipline mattered most. They touched down hard but upright tires, screaming engines roaring in protest before settling into silence. The cabin erupted. People cried openly. Strangers clutched one another. Relief washed through the aircraft like a physical force. Michael stepped back from the controls, suddenly aware of the weight in his limbs, the ache in his shoulders. He thanked Mark and checked the captain, who was beginning to stir. Then he turned and walked back through the aisle he had left behind. As Michael emerged into the cabin flight, attendants lined the aisle without being told. One by one they straightened and saluted him, the gesture sharp and unmistakable. Passengers followed, standing as best they could, applause thunderous and raw. The sound filled the space, overwhelming and undeserved in his mind. He reached his seat and knelt beside Emily, who wrapped her arms around his neck and whispered that he had saved everyone. Michael shook his head gently and told her he had only helped. He felt eyes on him from every direction, admiration and gratitude heavy in the air. Victoria stood among them, tears tracing silent lines down her face. The man she had mocked was not simply capable. He was extraordinary. The aircraft sat motionless on the runway engines, cooling lights still blazing against the Hawaiian night. Outside, emergency vehicles ringed the plane in a wide arc of red and white, their reflections sliding across the windows like restless ghosts. Inside, the adrenaline slowly drained from the cabin, leaving behind shaking hands, hoarse voices, and the fragile silence that follows survival. Michael remained seated beside Emily, one arm wrapped protectively around her shoulders. Only now did he allow himself to feel the exhaustion settle into his bones. His shirt clung damply to his back, and his hands trembled faintly despite his effort to steady them. Emily pressed her face into his chest, breathing him in as if confirming he was still there. He kissed the top of her head and whispered that everything was okay now. The words felt fragile, but they were true enough. A senior flight attendant approached her, posture formal, but her eyes shining. She thanked Michael quietly, not with the effusive praise of a grateful passenger, but with the respect of a professional acknowledging another. She informed him that the captain had regained consciousness and wanted to see him before deplaning. Michael nodded, though a familiar discomfort tightened in his chest. He had never known how to stand comfortably beneath gratitude. Across the aisle, Victoria Reynolds stood slowly, legs unsteady. She felt as though the ground beneath her had shifted permanently. The world she understood, one governed by hierarchy and appearance, had fractured in midair. She looked at Michael now and saw not the worn jacket or the quiet manner, but the composure that had steadied an entire aircraft. Shame moved through her in slow, heavy waves. Passengers whispered around her fragments of disbelief and awe. Someone mentioned a video from years ago, an emergency landing by a pilot called Raven. The name struck her like a physical blow. She remembered watching that footage late one night, marveling at the calm voice guiding a crippled aircraft safely down. She had admired that man without knowing him. And then she had mocked him while he sat beside her. Michael rose when asked and followed the attendant toward the cockpit. As he passed Victoria's row, she stepped into the aisle, blocking his path. For a moment, words failed her. The powerful executive who commanded rooms with ease could not command her own voice. When it came, it was unguarded. "I was wrong," she said, "about everything." Michael studied her, not with judgment, but with a quiet patience that made the moment heavier. He nodded once, accepting the apology without ceremony, and continued forward. The simplicity of his response deepened her shame far more than anger ever could. In the cockpit, the captain stood unsteadily, supported by a medic. His face was pale, his uniform rumpled, but his eyes were clear. When he saw Michael, he straightened as best he could and raised his hand in a salute that carried the full weight of his profession. He thanked Michael for saving his crew and his passengers. Michael returned the salute instinctively, years of training, answering without thought, and told the captain to take care of himself. The exchange was brief, sincere, and deeply human. By the time passengers were allowed to stand and prepare for deplaning, the story had already begun to spread. Phones were raised discreetly, whispers turning into certainty. The man in seat 12F had saved them. He had done it without fanfare, without demanding attention. That restraint only amplified the impact. As Michael returned to his seat to collect Emily, the first officer approached, eyes red with emotion. He asked where Michael had served. When Michael answered, the young pilot's expression shifted to something like reverence. He told Michael that the incident from years ago, the landing everyone studied in training, was still used as an example of what calm leadership looked like when everything went wrong. Michael listened, discomfort flickering, and deflected the praise with practiced humility. Emily took her father's hand as they stood to leave. She waved shyly at the flight attendants and smiled at Victoria, who could barely return the gesture through the tears welling in her eyes. As they stepped into the aisle, the cabin stirred again. Without instruction, without coordination, people began to stand. One by one, they applauded the sound swelling until it filled the aircraft, raw and unrestrained. Michael paused, overwhelmed. He lowered his head slightly, holding Emily close, and walked forward through the narrow aisle. He did not look back. He did not need to. The applause was not for recognition. It was for gratitude, and for the first time in years, he allowed himself to feel it without turning away. By the time dawn broke over Honolulu, the world already knew fragments of what had happened in the sky. Videos filmed with shaking hands spread across social feeds before the passengers even reached the terminal. Headlines formed quickly, clumsy, and incomplete, struggling to capture what fear and relief had done to strangers sealed together at altitude. Michael Carter ignored all of it. He sat in a quiet corner of the terminal with Emily asleep against his shoulder, her breathing slow and even grounding him more effectively than any applause ever could. Victoria Reynolds stood several yards away, watching without intruding. She had made dozens of calls since landing, rescheduling meetings, delaying negotiations, delegating authority she normally guarded fiercely. None of it felt important anymore. Her reflection in the terminal glass looked unfamiliar, stripped of certainty. The night had cracked something open in her, and she could not seal it shut again, no matter how hard she tried. Medical staff confirmed the captain would recover, but would never fly commercially again. The first officer remained close by, replaying every second in his mind, still shaken by how narrowly disaster had been avoided. When he finally approached Michael in the terminal, his voice broke. He thanked him again this time, not as a subordinate, but as a man who understood how close he had come to losing everything. Michael listened, offered a few quiet words, and reminded him that he had done his job, that he had stayed at the controls. That mattered. Victoria waited until the moment felt private enough and then approached. She introduced herself properly this time, without title or posture. She told Michael she would never forget what he had done, not just for the plane, but for her. She admitted without excuses that she had judged him, that she had confused appearance with worth. The words were difficult, but once spoken, they freed something in her chest. Michael accepted the apology with the same steady grace he had shown all night. He told her most people did not mean to judge. They simply did not pause long enough to see. He gathered Emily's bag, preparing to leave, assuming the encounter was finished. Victoria surprised herself by asking if she could do anything for him. Anything at all. Michael shook his head. He said he had what he needed. He glanced down at Emily, who stirred and smiled in her sleep, and that was answer enough. They parted then, each carrying something altered within them. Michael took Emily to a modest hotel near the airport, planning to continue their journey once flights resumed. He ordered room service pancakes because Emily loved them, and watched her wake with laughter, blissfully unaware of how close the night had come to rewriting her life entirely. He listened as she recounted the story in fragments, her version filled with certainty and pride. In her telling, fear never had the final word. Victoria flew to Tokyo later that day on a different aircraft, in a different cabin, with a different mind. She stared out the window for most of the flight, replaying moments she could not forget. The calm in Michael's voice, the way the cabin had responded, the realization that true authority did not demand attention. It earned it. When she arrived, she closed the deal as planned. The press praised her decisiveness, her vision. She accepted the accolades politely, but they rang hollow. That night alone in her hotel room overlooking the city, she opened her laptop and drafted a memo that would change her company in ways no acquisition ever could. She ordered a complete review of hiring practices, instructing her leadership team to actively recruit veterans and former military engineers. She established a fund to support their transition into civilian roles, not as charity, but as recognition of capability. The story broke fully 2 days later. Not through Michael, who refused every interview, but through passengers who could not forget what they had witnessed. Clips circulated of the crew saluting him, of the applause, of Emily's small hand waving. Commentators debated heroism, humility, and the danger of assumptions. Victoria did not hide from her part in it. When asked, she admitted her failure plainly. She said the most valuable lesson of her career had not come from a boardroom, but from a seat she assumed belonged to someone else. Michael read about it all on his phone while Emily colored beside him, unaware that her father's name was trending worldwide. He closed the article and focused on her instead. Fame had never been his goal. Survival had. Responsibility had. He answered emails from old colleagues, ignored offers he did not want, and returned quietly to Oregon weeks later, slipping back into a life that fit him better than any spotlight. Yet something lingered. Not pride, not regret, but a sense that the past no longer owned him as completely as it once had. He had not run from the sky. He had met it when it demanded him, and then he had walked away again, choosing differently. In a corner office thousands of miles away, Victoria Reynolds framed a single sentence and hung it where she could not ignore it. It read, "Dignity does not come from where you sit, but how you stand when the world tilts." She did not know if she would ever see Michael Carter again, but she knew she would never see people the same way. The change did not arrive loudly. It moved the way meaningful things often do, quietly, at first almost unnoticed, until its weight became undeniable. 3 months after the flight, Victoria Reynolds stood before the board of Reynolds Systems and announced an initiative that stunned even her closest advisors. It was not a marketing campaign, nor a public relations maneuver dressed in corporate language. It was a structural shift, a commitment. The company would actively recruit former military pilots, engineers, and technical officers, not as symbolic hires, as leaders, as problem solvers, as people whose calm under pressure could not be taught in any classroom. She called it the Starling Initiative. When asked why she told them a story instead of offering slides, she spoke of a child who believed without hesitation, of a father who stepped forward when no one else could, of how greatness often wore ordinary clothes. The room, accustomed to metrics and margins, sat in silence. The motion passed unanimously. Michael Carter learned about the initiative the way he had learned about most things lately, indirectly. An email from an old squadron mate. A message from a former engineer he barely remembered. a headline he did not open. He tried not to think about it too much. Attention had a way of distorting what mattered, and what mattered now was Emily sitting cross-legged on the living room floor, surrounded by model airplane parts, her tongue caught thoughtfully between her teeth. She had grown more curious since the flight. She asked questions that edged closer to the past Michael rarely spoke of. Not probing, not demanding, simply interested. One evening, as rain tapped softly against the windows, she asked him what his name had been in the Air Force. Not his real name, she clarified. His flying name. Michael hesitated, the word Raven rising unbidden to his lips. It carried weight, history, pain. He considered deflecting, but Emily was watching him with that same unfiltered trust she had shown on the plane. He told her. She repeated it slowly, tasting the sound. Raven, she said, like the bird. She nodded, thoughtful. Then she shook her head gently. That's your old name, she decided. You need a new one now. Michael smiled despite himself and asked what she meant. Emily considered this seriously. She told him ravens were smart and strong, but sometimes people were afraid of them. She liked birds that looked small, but traveled together, that knew where they were going even when the sky changed. She told him about starlings, how they flew in patterns that looked like living clouds. That should be my name, she said. Starling. Because I'm small, but I'm brave. The word settled into Michael's chest with unexpected force. He blinked, nodded once, and told her it was perfect. The invitation arrived a week later, printed on heavy paper, addressed by hand. Victoria Reynolds was hosting an event in San Francisco called Sky of Honor, a gathering meant to recognize people who had acted decisively and selflessly in moments of crisis. Michael intended to decline immediately. Recognition made him uncomfortable. He had done what his training demanded, nothing more. But Emily read the letter over his shoulder and frowned. They want to say thank you, she said. You always tell me thank you matters. Michael tried to explain that some thank yous carried expectations he did not want. Emily listened patiently, then offered her verdict. You don't have to like it, she said, but you should let them say it. Sometimes people need to say thank you more than you need to hear it. He did not argue after that. The night of the event, the city glowed with quiet confidence. Michael wore the leather flight jacket Victoria had sent weeks earlier, the one he had tried to return before Emily insisted he keep it. The embroidery was subtle, the craftsmanship impeccable. Raven stitched over the chest. He had not worn it in years, and yet it fit as if it had been waiting. Emily wore a simple dress, dark blue, with small silver starlings embroidered along the hem. She twirled once in front of the mirror and declared herself ready. Backstage, Victoria Reynolds paced uncharacteristically nervous. She had spoken on countless stages, addressed rooms filled with power and skepticism. But this felt different. This was personal. When Michael and Emily arrived, she greeted them without ceremony, kneeling to Emily's height and thanking her for sharing her father with the world. Emily accepted the gratitude solemnly, as if it were a responsibility rather than praise. The auditorium filled quickly. Business leaders, engineers, military families, people whose lives had been shaped by decisions made under pressure. When the lights dimmed, a hush fell that felt earned. Victoria stepped onto the stage and began without preamble. She told the truth about seat 12E, about her assumptions, about how close she had come to mistaking appearance for value. She spoke of the night the sky demanded competence, not confidence, and how one man had answered. Footage played behind her, not dramatized, not polished, Shaky clips from phones, the sound of Michael's voice steady over chaos the moment the aircraft touched down. Then images of him walking through an airport with Emily's hand in his unremarkable essential. Victoria paused, her voice thickening. She told the audience that the most dangerous myth in modern leadership was that power announced itself. That night, she said power had whispered, and it had saved every life on that plane. She invited Michael and Emily onto the stage. The applause was not explosive. It was sustained, deep, respectful. Michael felt his pulse in his ears as he walked forward, Emily's hand warm and certain in his. He had faced worse moments, but none quite like this. When the microphone reached him, he took a breath and spoke. He told them he was not a hero. He said heroes were the people who showed up every day without applause, nurses who worked double shifts, teachers who bought supplies with their own money, parents raising children alone while balancing jobs that never made headlines. He said he had been trained for crisis. Others were not, and yet they faced it anyway, armed with love and responsibility. That, he said, was courage. He thanked Victoria for her honesty. He said changing one's mind publicly took more strength than any emergency landing. The audience rose again, applause echoing off the walls. Afterward, as the crowd drifted into conversation, Emily tugged at Victoria's sleeve and asked if the Starling Initiative was really named after her. Victoria smiled and said yes, because a little girl reminded her that bravery did not require size or status. Emily beamed, satisfied. The initiative grew faster than anyone anticipated. Scholarships for children of veterans, engineering camps, flight training programs. Each recipient received a small pin shaped like a starling in flight. Michael received photos each year sent quietly by Victoria, proof that a single moment of crisis had rippled outward, touching lives that would never know the details, only the opportunity. One evening, months later, Michael and Emily sat on the porch, watching planes trace silent lines across the sky. Emily leaned against him and asked if he missed flying. Michael considered the question honestly. He told her he flew every day now, when he taught her angles and lift, when he helped her build wings out of cardboard, when he watched her imagine futures unafraid. Emily nodded, satisfied. She held up her pin, catching the last light of day. "Starling," she said softly. Michael smiled, the past finally quiet enough to let the future speak. The story did not end with applause or headlines that slowly dissolved into forgotten links. It continued quietly, the way meaningful change always does, through memory and choice. 1 year after the flight, Michael Carter woke before sunrise, the Oregon sky pale and open above his home. He did not need a calendar reminder. His body remembered the date. Somewhere overhead, an aircraft passed its distant hum, stitching the morning together. Emily noticed it too. She always did. At breakfast, she asked if today was the day the plane landed safely in Hawaii. Michael smiled and said yes. She nodded, thoughtful, as if marking a private anniversary. They made pancakes together, her favorite ritual, and she insisted on shaping them like airplanes. Life had returned to its gentle rhythms, but something inside both of them had settled into a deeper understanding of courage and restraint. That afternoon, Michael received a message from Victoria Reynolds. It was brief and personal, never meant for publicity. She sent a single photograph. A classroom filled with children from the Starling Initiative, their faces intent as they sketched wings and circuits. On the wall behind them hung a simple sentence: "Courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite it." Michael studied the image quietly, then returned to helping Emily balance the wings on her newest model. Victoria herself was in New York that week, standing in a glass-walled conference room overlooking the city she once believed defined success. She had just finished meeting a group of new hires, several of them veterans and former military engineers. They spoke less and listened more. When pressures surfaced, they did not rush to fill silence. They assessed, then moved. The culture of her company was changing in ways no report could fully explain. After the meeting, Victoria remained by the window, watching the city pulse below. She thought of the woman she had been in seat 12E, confident, certain, blind in ways she had never questioned. The memory no longer burned with shame, but with responsibility. Growth, she had learned, was not about erasing mistakes, but about refusing to repeat them. That evening, she attended a quiet dinner honoring Starling Scholarship recipients. There were no cameras, no speeches, only families sharing food and gratitude. She listened as parents spoke of second chances and futures once unimaginable. At one table, a young girl described her dream of designing safer aircraft, so no one would ever be afraid to fly. Victoria thought of Emily and felt purpose settle firmly in her chest. Back in Oregon, Michael and Emily drove to the small airfield outside town, a ritual reserved for clear days. They parked near the fence and watched planes rise and descend with unassuming grace. Emily asked why some planes looked heavy, but lifted so easily. Michael explained lift and balance, careful not to turn wonder into instruction too quickly. He had learned curiosity thrived when given room to breathe. As the sun dipped lower, a ground crew chief approached, recognizing Michael from the flight jacket he wore only on these visits. The man thanked him quietly, not for fame, but for showing what professionalism looked like under pressure. Michael returned the handshake and the salute offered without thinking the gesture now gentle rather than painful. Later, as they walked back to the car, Emily asked why people still thanked him. Michael considered the question. He told her that when frightening things happen, people remember the calm they witnessed so they can find it again later. He said he was glad if that helped. Emily thought carefully, then said she hoped she could help people feel calm someday too. That night, after Emily fell asleep, Michael stood alone on the porch. The stars were bright, the sky wide and patient. For years he had believed his past defined him, that one mistake had narrowed his future. The flight had not erased that past, but it had reframed it. He had not been punished by the sky. He had been trusted once more, and then allowed to walk away. Across the country, Victoria Reynolds placed a small framed photograph on her desk. It showed a father and daughter walking through an airport aisle, hands linked, faces forward. No caption, no explanation, just a reminder. Leadership, she now understood, was not about commanding attention, but recognizing quiet strength and choosing to honor it. Months later, Emily was invited to speak at a Starling gathering. Standing on a small stage, feet barely touching the floor, she told the audience that starlings flew together so they would not get lost. She said her dad taught her that being brave did not mean being loud. It meant being ready. The room listened as wisdom arrived in a small voice. When they returned home that night, Emily leaned against Michael and asked if he was proud of her. He told her he was proud every day. She smiled and fell asleep before they reached the driveway. The world continued filled with people passing one another too quickly to see. But sometimes a story cut through the noise, reminding those who listen to look longer than a heartbeat. Michael Carter never sought legacy. Yet in choosing humility over recognition, presence over escape, he left one behind. And somewhere between sky and ground, a little bird called Starling kept flying forward brave because it knew where it belonged. From a professional perspective, This story is not about aviation wealth or coincidence. It is about decision-making under pressure, about character revealing itself when systems fail and titles lose meaning. In moments of crisis, true authority does not announce itself with status or appearance. It shows up as calm responsibility and the willingness to act for others without expecting reward. That is the kind of leadership that saves lives, changes organizations, and quietly reshapes the future. If this story made you pause, reflect, or see people differently, take a moment to support stories like this. Like the video, if you believe humility still matters. Subscribe if you want more stories that remind us where real strength comes from. And before you go, leave a comment with just 2 words that capture the heart of this story: quiet courage.